Hello, welcome back. In this video we'll discuss the three quantum processes. These three quantum processes are mainly the result of the interaction of energy or radiation with the matter. The three processes are absorption, spontaneous emission, and the stimulated emission. Consider an atomic system with two energy levels, namely E1 and E2. E1 being the ground state or the lower energy level, say this is E1, and E2 is the excited state or the higher energy level. Let us also assume that you have a photon whose energy is h nu, which is equal to E2 minus E1. Suppose that a photon whose energy is h nu comes in contact with an atom in which the electron is in its ground state or in the E1 state. Under such conditions, the electron interacts with the energy and absorbs the energy. Thereby, the electron goes to the excited state by absorbing the energy. This process is called as absorption. To be exact, the absorption is happening only when certain amount of energy or a photon is supplied to the system. So this absorption process is also called as stimulated absorption process. Stimulated absorption. And in nature we do not have spontaneous absorption. This is not present in nature. Only the stimulated absorption is present. Once the electron goes to the excited state, it remains there for a very small time, which is called as the lifetime of the energy state. And the lifetime of the energy state is quite small. This is a very small duration, after which the electron automatically makes a downward transition by releasing the energy that it has absorbed while making an upward transition from E1 energy state to E2. Now what is happening is the electron is making a downward transition from energy level E2 to energy level E1. When a downward transition happens, energy will be released, and the energy released will be equal to the difference between these two energy levels, that is E2 minus E1. And we know very well that E2 minus E1 is h nu. So whatever energy that is absorbed initially, the same amount of energy is released now. And this process is called as spontaneous emission process. Suppose you have an electron in its excited state and a photon whose energy is equal to E2 minus E1 comes in resonance with the electron that is in the excited state. Then this photon can force a downward transition of the electron from energy level E2 to E1, and while making a downward transition, another photon is released. So the initial photon is triggering, or it is initiating, or it is forcing a downward transition from E2 to E1. Thereby we are having the initial photon and the photon emitted from the downward transition process. Here we have two photons. One important aspect to note is that the second photon that is released during the downward transition process will be identical to the photon that has forced or triggered the downward transition. So we will be getting two identical photons from a downward transition of this type. And these type of downward transitions are called as stimulated emission. Here the downward transition is stimulated by the incident photon whose energy is equal to E2 minus E1. Thereby we are getting two identical photons. One photon is the incident photon, and it triggers the downward transition and forces a downward transition. During the downward transition, another photon also is released, and these two photons will be identical, and this kind of a downward transition or emission process is called as stimulated emission process. In this video, we have started our discussion with an atomic system with two energy levels, namely E1 and E2. The difference between these two energy levels is E2 minus E1, that is equal to h nu. And if you have a photon whose energy is h nu, comes in resonance with the electron that is there in the ground state. After absorbing the energy, the electron in the ground state goes to the excited state. This process is called as absorption or stimulated absorption process. And the electron that has gone to the excited state makes a downward transition automatically after certain amount of small time which is called as lifetime, and this kind of a process is called as spontaneous emission process. In this, a photon is emitted. The emitted photon will have energy that is equal to E2 minus E1. Similarly, while the electron is in the excited state, if another photon of the same energy comes in resonance with excited electron, then two identical photons will be released in this process, and at the end of the process the electron goes to the ground state or E1 state, and this process is called as stimulated emission process. These are the three quantum processes that are involved in lasing or in any process where radiation interacts with the matter. They are absorption, spontaneous emission, and stimulated emission. Thank you.